We're good to go. Good afternoon, everybody. You're very welcome to the Institute of International European Affairs, where we're delighted this afternoon to have a conversation on delivering energy independence for Ireland. And I'm very glad to be joined by Noel Cunniffe, the Chief Executive of Wind Energy Ireland, and I will introduce Noel properly in a few minutes. I'm Fergal McNamara, and I'm an adjunct professor at the UCD Energy Institute, and I'm very glad to be chairing this session this afternoon. Noel will address us for 20 or 25 minutes, and then it's over with you. We'll have a conversation with Noel up until 2 o'clock on the topics that are raised in the presentation or any place else you'd like to take it. For those of you in the room, please wait for the mic to come round to you, say your name and affiliation. And to those of you online, you're very welcome too. I think you know by now to enter your questions or comments into the Q&A function in Zoom just as soon as they actually occur to you. Don't wait till the end of Noel's presentation or any time else, just as soon as they occur to you. For those of you on the social media, please tag us at IIEA on your Twitter feed or your LinkedIn feeds. We'd be grateful for that. Thank you very much. So Noel, you're most welcome here to the IIEA this afternoon. You're the Chief Executive of Wind Energy Ireland, which is the trade association for the wind energy industry and the largest renewable association in the land. Before you were CEO there, you were also a policy and driving the policy on onshore and offshore wind. And before that, with the TSO EirGrid on market design, system operations and planning. You're a chartered engineer, and we're very grateful for your coming this afternoon to have this conversation with us. Ladies and gentlemen, Noel Cunniffe.
Thanks a million, Fergal. That's definitely the best anyone's ever introduced me in my entire life, without notes, I should say. He didn't have notes. That's great. So delighted to be here and delighted to, and thank you very much to the IIEA for the invitation to speak to you. As Fergal mentioned, I'm Chief Executive in Wind Energy Ireland. So just to kind of kick off, who are Wind Energy Ireland for anyone that doesn't know us? So we're the largest renewable energy organisation on the island of Ireland. We have over 200 companies that are part of our membership, and they are not just the developers, which is typically who people think we are associated with. It is those developers that identify greenfield or brownfield sites, but it's also the entire value chain that helps to deliver any wind energy project. So that ranges from the planners that help to get planning permission for the projects, to the grid consultants that provide advice, to the law firms, to the consultants right across the board, and the haulage companies that help bring things to and from sites as well. So we really are a broad church. We group our members into expert groups, and they help us to form policy positions, respond to consultation responses, and then ultimately come up with thought leadership positions for the sector as well. What I'm going to try to do over the next 20 minutes is to convince you of three things. The first is that wind energy is our greatest asset as a country when it comes to trying to respond to the climate emergency. The second thing is that Ireland is going to be energy independent, and we're going to do that whenever we decide to, because the decisions that we make now will decide when that will happen. So I'll take you through a bit of the history of the sector, and then I'll take you through what the future over the next 20, 25 years looks like, and what some of the biggest challenges that we're trying to overcome to hit that target look like. This is why I do my job. What you're seeing here in front of you, and it just goes back to that last point around the decisions we make now decide when. This is the IPCC report that looked at what the future might look like for humanity when it comes to climate. To me, this was the best illustration I'd ever seen in terms of the variation that we could experience as humans on the temperature changes that will impact our society. The reason that it really stuck with me in particular is that top bar there, born in 2020. I've got a son that was born in 2020, and he's going to be 70 years old in 2090. And he'll get to experience one of those worlds on the right-hand side. And what that world looks like is totally dependent on how we decide to decarbonize, how quickly we can do that, and also what it'll mean for the entire society here in Ireland and wider. That's probably the let's say the doom doom side of that report. I would point to then the positive side of that report, which identified the best mitigation options that we have as society for trying to address this. And the top two things are wind and solar generation, things that we do in abundance today that we have available to us right around the globe. And thankfully for us in Ireland, we happen to be one of the most windiest countries on the entire planet. And when it comes to offshore wind energy, we have a maritime area that is 7 times the size of our land area. So if you look at what the space is available for us for offshore wind energy in particular, it really is massive. We're one of the largest countries in Europe, but 7/8 of us is underwater. That's the way to think about it. So what are our targets and what are we trying to do in the power sector? So at the beginning of this decade, the power sector was responsible for emitting about 10 million tons of emissions every year. As a country, we emit 60 million tons. So we were responsible for 10 million of that. And our goal by 2030 is to try to reduce that down by 75%. So as a country, we need to go from 60 million tons to 30 million tons, and then we're going to play a contribution to that of about 7 to 8 million tons that we'll remove. The government set targets to be able to hit that objective. The first target that they set was to try to get to 9,000 megawatts of onshore wind energy. Today, we have just crossed, actually this week, 5,000 megawatts of that. So we have to install another 4,000 over the next 6 years or so, and I'll talk a little bit about how we're progressing with that in a second. The second thing that we need to do is we need to try to deliver 5,000 megawatts of offshore wind energy. We have 25 megawatts installed at the moment. So to go from 25 to 5,000 is a huge challenge. We will not hit this target. That's very clear now, that we won't hit 5,000 megawatts by 2030. But we can do it in about 2032, 2033. And again, I'll talk to some of the challenges there. What a lot of people don't realize in society is what wind energy is doing for us today. So to give you a sense of that, and particularly in the impact that it is having on consumers, every single month for the past 2 years, we've produced our wind energy monthly report. We published the November results this morning. So what you're seeing here is fairly fresh off the page. And what we've done is we've tried to demonstrate the average prices of electricity on the days when we have the most wind energy available and then the least wind energy available. And what you can see there is there's nearly a 50% decrease in wholesale electricity price on the days with the most wind compared to the days with the least wind. And on average, we're coming in about 25% cheaper than the average power price in the market on those most windy days. So the more that we can capture it, the better. The second thing that we started doing is almost just key facts that people can pull every single month to try to understand that. And we've started presenting the top 5 counties each month as to how much wind energy they've produced. And the main objective and the idea behind that is to try to stoke a little bit of inter-county rivalry. And it's been very interesting. Cork and Kerry kind of go over and back every month. And you can hear Kerry FM or 96 FM taking huge credit on the month that they're beating Cork beats Kerry or Kerry beats Cork. So on Kerry FM this morning, they're all about beating Cork last month in wind energy. So it's great to see that type of competition coming through. Over the course of the year, we've got about 1/3 of Ireland's electricity from wind energy, and that'll bring us up to about 40% renewables in total when solar and other types of renewables are taken into account as well. Last year, one of the other benefits that we had on the sector was the ability to not import or burn as much gas as we would have had to do if we didn't have this wind energy available to us. So every year, Baringa produces this report for us. It gives a sense of how much money our country has saved that we would have otherwise had to spend on gas, which is mostly imported now. Corrib is starting to definitely not run dry, but it's running at a much lower percentage of output than it was in previous years. So we are importing a lot of that. And you can see the cumulative savings building up. In 2022, those savings were 2 billion. So over the past 2 years, we've saved 3.6 billion. That is roughly the amount of equivalent emissions as to 1.9 million cars. So it's a massive amount of emissions that we are saving as a result of this too. If you look at the other economic impacts of wind, this is something, again, that we are trying to communicate a little broader, the opportunities that are there for the sector. Today, Ireland, we can categorically say, are a world leader when it comes to onshore wind energy. That amount of our electricity that we produce from onshore wind energy is more than anyone else in Europe. We are second in the world only to Uruguay, and we're going to beat them someday. From an onshore wind perspective, we are the best country in Europe as a percentage of our demand. What that means in terms of, there's stats here, hopefully we can send on this information a little bit afterwards, but some of the key things that I did want to point out is that there's more than 5,000 people employed in the sector today for onshore wind alone, and that's going to go to above 7,000 by 2030. Every single year, we're adding over 400 million euro into the Irish economy, and that's going to go up to about 550 million euro of gross added value over the course of the next 5 years or so as well. So it's something that we as a country should be very proud of. It's been our best contributor towards reducing our emissions, but it's also a very large and growing contributor to our economy as well. For offshore wind energy, that is where our potential lies. We can and will be a global leader in offshore wind, and there are tens of thousands of jobs that can be unlocked in our economy if we can do that by 2050. Some of the graphics are a little wonky there on the screen, but what you can see is we're looking at about 20 billion euro of an investment needed to deliver these projects. By 2030, they will deliver 5,000 jobs. This is just our 2030 targets, and that will be responsible for about 40% of Ireland's electricity if we can deliver that 5 gigawatts, or when we deliver that 5 gigawatts in the early 2030s. There are two enablers for this, and I'll talk about them in a little bit more detail, but one is investing in our own domestic supply chain. It's trying to get our ports ready and able to deliver this offshore wind. And secondly, it's about skills development and being able to bring the people along and develop the talent that we need at the right point in time. One thing I did want to lean into and give you just a brief snapshot of, this is something that we're going to be launching in the next week or two. It's playing back into that county by county rivalry, and it's trying to again communicate what wind energy is doing for you at a local level. So it's great to see that national level, 5,000 jobs, huge amount of millions of euro into our economy. What does that actually mean for my local area? On our website in the next couple of days, you're going to be able to find this page. You'll be able to click on the GAA jersey of your liking, whatever county it is, and you'll be able to get statistics for what your county is doing in wind energy. So to give you an insight into Kerry, Kerry's Ireland's largest producer of wind energy on a county level, so nearly 13%. And you can see there the amount of emissions that's being saved from Kerry alone, the amount that's invested in local community benefit funds, more than €500,000 every single year. And interestingly, and this is again a part that a lot of society doesn't see, it's the contribution that these wind farms make to local rates. So what amount of a county council's budget is coming from wind farms, and 10.5% of Kerry. Now I know what you're all thinking. What is Roscommon doing? Because I'm from Roscommon, so I just wanted to show this. This just goes to show you that even if you take a county like Roscommon, it's only producing 3% of Ireland's installed wind energy. But as a percentage of rates, again, that bottom right-hand side number, 14% of the council's entire budget is coming thanks to wind farms. For some counties like Leitrim, that's nearly 30%. So these are huge contributors into rural Ireland. Last thing I wanted to say on just where we're at today is that because of these types of messages and the impact that people are seeing on the ground, thanks to wind energy in their counties and in their countries, the actual support for wind energy is growing year on year. If you go back 10 years ago, there was a huge amount of opposition to wind energy. That just isn't the case anymore. And when we're engaging with the majority of projects, there is quite a level of support or very low level resistance. So about 4 in 5 people are very supportive of wind energy. If you go to people's feelings and inputs in their local area, particularly those that already live around wind farms, you'll find about 3 in 5 want more wind in their area. Only 1 in 20 oppose it. And I challenge any of you to find anything in all of society where you can't find 1 in 20 people that will not like it. So really, I think the 3 messages that are coming out and resonating with people, particularly in the last 2 years, is that renewable energy provides cheaper electricity. It reduces emissions, it's good for environment, but I think that cheaper electricity aspect and angle of things is something that's really striking with people. So that's where we're at today. What are we doing in the future and what is happening? So as I mentioned, we're just about to cross the 5,000 megawatts of wind energy energized. That will happen. There's 2 wind farms that were just switched on in the last 2 weeks. That brings us above 5,000 megawatts. They need to do some testing. So we're about to get that officially in the next, before the end of the year. There is over 500 megawatts in construction today. So these are projects that have progressed through planning. They're going through their grid connections and they're entering into construction. They have a route to market. And what does that mean? Well, route to market is where the next bunch comes. These are projects that are supported through the RES scheme. So the RES scheme is the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme. It's government's contracting scheme with renewable electricity, both wind and solar, to offer them 15 to 20-year contracts for their power. They all compete in an auction and the government picks the cheapest projects. The other angle there is corporate PPAs. This is where a wind farm or a solar farm has signed a contract with typically a large energy user for their power over a 10 to 20-year time frame, depending on the large energy user and depending on the contract. And then those projects are funded and they're able to build. Some of the biggest challenges that we've had in recent years have been getting through the planning system, but there are still quite a few projects that are through it and ready to go into the next auction or to go into a corporate PPA, so 750 megawatts roughly. Over in the past few weeks, we've just had a big increase in the amount of projects that have gotten through planning. There was a deadline at the end of November, and An Bord Pleanála granted planning permission for 420 megawatts in the past 4 weeks to hit that deadline. So those are the projects that are ready to go in to get a grid connection to try to then go and connect or participate in the next auction. And then finally, there's a huge amount of projects that are in planning. There's over 30 projects across the country in planning right now. 1,500 megawatts. And then over the next 12 months, there's about another 2 gigawatts that's going to enter in. So we have really hit a period in the onshore wind development pipeline where projects are consistently going into planning year on year on year on year. And as I will show a little bit later on, An Bord Pleanála are now getting up to speed. They've gotten people back in, they've got their governance structures identified, and they're starting to make decisions at a much more regular cadence. For offshore wind energy, what's happening there? Well, this is the graphic of roughly what's happening in offshore wind, and I'll explain it in 2 parts. 3 parts, actually. I'll start with where offshore wind energy began, which is Arklow Bank Phase 1. That's the bottom right-hand side of your screen there. That project was built in 2004. It is 25 megawatts. It was built by SSE and GE, Eddie O'Connor, who I'm sure many of you will remember or know. Helped to develop that project at a time when it really was an outlier in terms of Ireland's energy policy. Those turbines are still spinning. 20 years later, they were the largest turbines in the world at the time, so we were a world leader when it came to offshore wind energy, and we will be again in future. The other names then that you see around that screen are what is called Phase 1 projects. So these are 6 projects. There's 5 off the east coast and there's 1 off the west coast, Scared Rocks. 4 of those were successful in government's offshore auction, which took place last year. The other 2 projects are in the process of trying to secure contracts with large energy users through corporate PPAs. All of these projects are going to be in the planning system before the end of the year. 4 are there already. 1 is going in next week and the other one will go in before the end of the year as well. And they're all trying to deliver before 2030. So this is what's capable of delivering for offshore wind by 2030. It's 4,000 megawatts in total when all of them are delivered. The second phase then, and this is where the rest of our 5 gigawatt target comes from, is located off the south coast. You'll see there that yellow line at the bottom and the 4 sites in green, A, B, C, and D. This was part of a government mechanism called a DMAP, a Designated Marine Area Plan. It's basically like a county development plan for a portion of the sea, and it zones areas that are appropriate to develop offshore wind energy. So they chose those 4 areas that in total have a capacity of about 8 to 9 gigawatts of power. So there's a huge amount of potential there. And what they're going to do is release those sites one by one in either an auction scheme or what's called a seabed leasing competitive process, where projects will compete to effectively rent out the seabed. So the first of those sites, Area A, that's going into auction next year. And we think there's probably going to be around 7 to 10 different companies or consortia that will compete in that. And it's a 900 megawatt project, and that'll deliver then in the early 2030s. So the auction will happen next year. Site B, Minister Ryan announced just before he left office, will be auctioned off in likely early 2026. It'll get going towards the end of next year. And that is a site that's about 1,100 to 1,500 megawatts in capacity. So again, a really big contributor that'll deliver in the mid-2030s. One critical enabler for offshore wind energy that Ireland currently does not have is our ports. And one key message from our sector is that we want to build Irish offshore wind farms from ports in Ireland. We, over the last 2 years, have produced 2 pieces of research to help support this. The first was called the National Port Study, and this looked at the capability of all of the ports around Ireland and how they could be enabled or how ready they were to deliver offshore wind energy. So that was done in 2022. In 2023, we zoned in on the biggest barrier that those projects have to overcome, and that's funding. At the moment, it's very difficult to fund those ports to be able to get them to build. 3 things is what they need. They need a large enough area available to store the turbines, to store what's called the nacelles, which is the middle part of the turbine. These are very large components. They need area to do that. They need a very deep entryway into the port so that very large ships can come in and take this equipment on board. So in many situations, those ports around Ireland will need to be dredged to be able to get a depth that's able for those ships. And then the third thing is they need piers that can take the weight of the equipment. So at the moment, the only port on the island of Ireland that can meet all those 3 requirements is in Belfast. So Belfast can only build 1 project at a time. It's a great port, and it will deliver some of those projects I mentioned, but we can't hit our targets with just Belfast. And if we don't have more ports ready, then unfortunately the projects will need to be built out of Britain or France or Norway or Belgium. There's lots of different options that are being considered. And getting these ports funding so that they can proceed into planning and get them developed is one of the biggest enablers for us as an economy to benefit from these projects. I'm going to talk about 4 things that are current barriers to being able to hit the targets that I just spoke about. So the first is our planning system and how we can enable a faster planning system. We've seen some progress in that recently, as I've mentioned. One thing that On Board Pleanála have done is they've really started to resource up the skills that they have for offshore wind energy, the amount of people that they have working on renewable energy projects. We've also seen the new Planning and Environment Court come in, which will help legal cases or judicial reviews to be able to progress faster and faster. What I'm showing you here is just a summary of the onshore wind projects that have been in the planning system this year so far. There's been about 2,800 megawatts of projects, in planning throughout the course of the year. We had 10 projects approved. We had 12 projects that were refused, and about half of them are still in with On Board Pleanála right now. Average decision times have reduced from about 100 weeks down to about 60 weeks. So that's a real improvement, and it's great to see. One of the main reasons that projects are getting refused, and this refusal rate of about 50-50 is very high compared to historical rates. It used to be about 80% approval for projects. Now it's down to about 50%. One of the main reasons for that has been rezoning that's taken place on county development plans in Ireland over the past 3 or 4 years or so. So what do I mean by that? Well, I've given some examples here of where if you take this as County Kilkenny, and you can see here that the land that's been zoned, the grey is areas that are not permissible for wind energy. The yellow is open to consideration, and then green is acceptable in principle. So generally, you should try to locate your projects near there. There was a number of projects that were developing in Kilkenny in areas that might have been grey or yellow, because in the previous county development plan, they would have been zoned favourably for onshore wind. It takes about 7 to 8 years to develop an onshore wind project. So when you start you as a project, you have to go with the county development plan at that time. What happened in many instances is those plans were rezoned while the projects were either in planning or about to go into planning. And then that leads to challenges for the projects. When you apply constraints onto this map and you look at where are the roads, where are the rivers, where are the houses, so that you can't build wind energy around that. That map reduces from this down to this. So there's about a 99.7% reduction in the available area after that county development plan was updated and rezoned, and it's created problems for projects that were in the planning system or about to enter into the planning system because they were in areas that were no longer zoned appropriately. And An Bord Pleanála are now unfortunately rejecting those projects. Similar examples could be shown in many other counties. I've just shown Tipperary here, where they use a different type of metric. Only 2 open to consideration are unsuitable. Unfortunately, again, when you take into account project, let's say, limitations around proximity to houses or roads or rivers, you do have a huge reduction in that available area. Now, that's being changed. That's the good news in all of this. The new national planning framework that is waiting in the desks of Leinster House to be published once the new government is in place sets new targets for zoning of land area for wind and solar energy and housing on top of that as well. Once that's approved, then all these county development plans are going to be reopened once more, and more land is going to be zoned for wind and solar to try to get these projects through faster. So that's the planning system. That's the biggest challenge that's happening. We don't have that much experience from an offshore wind perspective on the planning side yet. We're hoping for the first decisions on that in the second half of next year. So let's keep an eye on that. The second thing I want to talk about is the grid. So I'm sure people are hearing about this more and more, how grid capacity is the enabler for decarbonisation, for growing our economy, and for securing our electricity supply. Last year, we set up a new project in combination with a number of different groups like Engineers Ireland, like Chambers Ireland, and other renewable bodies, and it is called Build Our Grid. And Build Our Grid, you can go on the website today. The idea behind it is the biggest barrier to grid development is not it's not financial. There is money there to invest in our grid. That actually has never been the problem for the past 10 years. There has been budgets given to EirGrid and TSP networks that they've really struggled to use. The biggest challenge has been societal acceptance and political willingness to deliver on the grid when it's done, when projects are proposed, I should say. And we were increasingly hearing back from local TDs, from local councillors, that they were constantly hearing about people that did not want grid in their area, and they never heard from people that wanted grid. So the idea behind this project and this campaign is to try to promote people and businesses and communities that will say, I actually want grid in my area because it's going to enable my business, it's going to enable more houses in my area, it's going to enable a future for my children in my constituency. We've used it during the election process. We've used it in the summer to run a number of different campaigns to get elected officials involved and interested in building the grid. So go and give it a look. One other interesting area of grid and clear wins for infrastructure in the budget, I'll talk about the left-hand side first, and then the right-hand side relates to the ports point I was making. In Budget 2025, for the first time, the government are talking about putting an equity injection into the electricity grid. So they said an initial direct investment of €750 million into the grid. So this is where the government will pay for grid infrastructure that will not then find its way back through grid charges on consumer bills, which is typically how the grid is paid for at the moment. One thing that Simon Harris said is that nobody will come up to me on the street and say, thanks for putting €750 million into the power grid. Well, I will, definitely. I'll give him a big hug if I see him and tell him that. But this is exactly the type of investment that we need, and it's the type of leadership that we need from politicians and from government, because if we don't do this, then our economy cannot grow, our decarbonisation cannot happen, and we're going to continue to be exposed in a security of supply point of view. It was also great to see, to the point about ports earlier, we saw the first investment in the Port of Cork. So the Port of Cork is now going to be able to build out offshore wind energy from about 2026, 2027, which is great. The third point I just wanted to talk about, and it's getting a lot of actually media today, and I saw it in a few other places too recently, is about creating customers. So the concept behind this is that in the future, Ireland is going to have much more wind or renewable energy than we know what to do with. We're going to have a surplus. And the government needs to decide how we spend that surplus and how we invest our renewable energy and what action we take. And there's a number of options. You can invest in electricity interconnection, where you can export that power directly in electrons. You can invest in local manufacturing or local industries or large energy users, and you can add value to that power. So you can use it to grow our demand, add value to it, and then export that value through products. That's, I would say, our ideal outcome of all of this. And then the third option would be to turn electricity into something else. And typically what is being talked about is hydrogen, so green hydrogen. And then you can use that green hydrogen to turn it into another product like an aviation fuel or a green ammonia or fertilizer, and you can sell that product, or else you can just directly export the hydrogen. If you look at the scale of demand that we're talking about, so this is from a piece of work that Paul Dean in Mayo did for us 3 years ago. It looked at the growth. So what you're seeing on the left is where we were in 2019, 2020. The middle is 2030, and then the right is 2050. The left-hand side is all about our electricity demand. We've about 30 terawatt hours. I think we're at about 32, 33 terawatt hours of demand today. We're going to add about a quarter onto our demand by 2030, and then by 2050 it's just an enormous increase in our demand, and that's because of an electrification of our society, all of our heat, all of our transport electrifying. The best way to decarbonize the heat and transport sectors is to put a plug on it. Put a plug on your end use, be that through an EV or public transport or a heat pump. And that's what that looks like with our own domestic demand. Our capability of generating more and more electricity actually far outweighs that 84 terawatt hours there. We could, if we hit the program for government targets, we're well into the 100, 150 terawatt hour in terms of energy creation. But how we spend that then is really what the question is about. One thing and one area that we are looking into is trying to promote that electrification of society. So earlier this year, we set up a brand new sister organisation called Ireland Electrified. And the idea behind it is trying to promote electrification of heat and transport. It's an area that really was not getting a policy focus from different parts of the industry. There was no group out there championing for say heat pumps or EVs or reducing electricity costs on a large scale. So I'd encourage you all to have a look at that. It's had its first annual conference there last week. And it is developing policy papers on how to make it more attractive to electrify. The biggest issue with electrification at the moment is that gas is too cheap in comparison to electricity. The spark gap is what that's called, where the gas price and the electricity price, and you need a ratio of about 2 to 1 in terms of gas to electricity. So 2 to 1 to try to make it cheaper enough to encourage people to decarbonize and to electrify. So give that a look and please do think about getting involved. So creating customers is a big focus for the future of the wind sector, because we need to know the customers that we're going to sell power to. Otherwise, it's hard to actually go about creating projects or developing projects. The fourth thing, and I'll briefly touch on this, is all about developing people and skills there. And if we get this right as a country, then the opportunity for us as a society is absolutely enormous to grow skills, to develop and retain talent here, and to create futures for them in all aspects of the sector. There are genuinely tens of thousands of jobs possible in the offshore wind sector. If we can harness some of that manufacturing, we're not going to get turbines, but we might get cables, we might get foundations. There's options there for how we can develop that, and getting our ports is the first thing, but after that, growing our education facilities around our ports. Two things that I wanted to call out. The first is that we set up a new initiative called Work in Wind. This is really geared towards second level students. Students can go on there, they can do a quiz and say, do you like working alone or with a team? Do you like working inside or outside? Are you more analytical? Are you more creative? And when they fill out that, they'll get a list of career options in the energy sector, and they'll get a list of courses that they can do right around Ireland in third level institutes to point them towards that. The second thing is trying to grow our offshore wind pipeline and talent. And if we can hit that 2050 target, then the Irish economy is expected to benefit by about 38 billion euro in terms of investment in our people and what those people will generate for our economy. We've been working with the government through the Offshore Wind Energy Task Force to launch new websites around offshore wind energy, where on offshorewind.ie you can go in, you can see what a project looks like, you can click on the projects that are in development, you'll get information on where those projects are, what types of jobs those projects need right now, and again, what types of courses that you can do to be able to participate and learn and develop in that. You can take a career quiz. It doesn't have to be related to third level. It could be an apprenticeship, and there's loads of options there. So again, if you've anybody that's interested in mid-career switching into the offshore sector and they don't know how to do it, this is the website to go and to check out. On top of this, in recent weeks, we've partnered with SkillNet Ireland to launch a brand new initiative called SkillNet Offshore Wind Academy. We're going to be partnering, and we already are partnering with UCD, UCC, UL, University of Maynooth, University of Galway, and others to develop third level courses in electricity grids, in electricity markets, in planning, in environmental impacts assessments. It's the courses that people want now, and these are mid-career courses, so they're called professionalships, where you can go and take one module in a university, you'll get a credit towards it, and over time you can build up a master's degree in your area over the course of several years. So that's the end of my problems and my solutions to those problems. And I hope I've managed to convince you even a little bit that wind energy is our greatest asset to the climate emergency. It is absolutely possible that we will become energy independent in the next 10 to 15 years. But the decisions that we make now on those issues will decide when that happens. So thank you very much and looking forward to the discussion.